Pick up the thing in your hand, the phone, or whatever screen you are watching this on. In the last video, we spent 2 hours on what that object is doing to your memory and your attention. The vector, the thing you carried across your own threshold and charged beside your head every night. And I left you with it as a sickness. I want to turn it around now, because that was only half of what it is. That object is not only something happening to you, it is something we made. And when you go back into the oldest written records on Earth and look for what men were warned not to build, that thing in your hand is not a warning about a disease. It is item number 2 on a list of 7. And the list is 4,000 years old, and 6 of the 7 now exist. Here is the frame, and I want it clean before we start, because I am not going to pretend the tablets predicted technology. They did not. There is no cuneiform prophecy about machines. What the tablets describe is something narrower and, honestly, stranger, a boundary. Over and over, in text after text, Mesopotamian tradition insists that the crafts of civilization were not invented by men. They were given, handed down complete, and given with a limit attached. Adapa is offered wisdom and denied the one thing that would have made him permanent. Gilgamesh finds the plant that reverses age and loses it in a moment. Humanity is permitted to exist and then permanently prevented from multiplying without restraint. The tower is built and the builders are scattered. And the scholars who inherited all of this stamped an access clause into the bottom of their own tablets. Let the one who knows show the one who knows. The one who does not know may not see. And called the breach of it an abomination of the great gods. That is not a world where knowledge is free. That is a world where knowledge is rationed, and the ration has a penalty written under it. Tonight we are going to walk the far side of that boundary. 7 things the oldest records say men were not to build. And for each one, I am going to show you the object we actually built, the real project, the real date, the real published paper, and the real caveat. Because several of these have been badly overstated, and I will tell you exactly where. The 6th one landed in our own decade, in a peer-reviewed journal, and its parallel to the tablets is so exact it made me stop working for a while. And the 7th is not finished. The 7th is funded, announced, and has a 5-year plan. The tablet said it would happen, and it is happening. Before the first one, you need the foundation, where this idea of rationed knowledge actually comes from in the texts, and what serious scholarship says about it at full strength. Start at Eridu, the oldest city. In Sumerian tradition, the god Enki holds, in his freshwater domain beneath the earth, a set of things called the Me. Not objects exactly, and not laws exactly. The closest English gets is something like the operating instructions of civilization. Kingship is one. Priesthood is one. The scribal art is one. The crafts of the metalworker and the builder and the leatherworker are ones. Truth is one. So is descent into the underworld. And so is the art of straightforwardness. And so, disconcertingly, are things like strife and the destruction of cities. Roughly 100 of them are listed in the composition Scholars Catalog as Inanna and Enki. About 94 still readable. The whole point of the story is that Inanna has to get them from Enki by trickery and carry them off to her own city, which tells you the essential thing. In the Sumerian imagination, the components of civilization are finite, held, transferable, and owned by somebody who is not you. Then the teachers. The same tradition says the arts were brought to men by the Apkallu, the 7 sages who came out of the water before the flood, taught writing and cities and law and agriculture, and then were withdrawn. And the Babylonian priest Berossus, writing for the Greeks around 280 years before Christ, put the consequence in a single flat sentence that ought to be more famous than it is. After the sages finished teaching, he says, "Nothing further has been discovered." Read that again. A Babylonian scholar, in the age of Alexander's successors, believed that human beings had discovered exactly nothing new since the beginning. Everything was delivered, and after delivery, the well closed. And now the part that is not myth at all. Go and look at actual Mesopotamian scholarly tablets, real objects, in real collections, cataloged and published, and look at the bottom, where the scribe signs off. Many of them carry a clause, not a curse for stealing the tablet, though those exist too, an access restriction. The formula runs in its most common shape. Let the one who knows show the one who knows. The one who does not know may not see. And it is frequently followed by the word Ikib, an abomination, a taboo, of Anu and Enlil, or of Nabu, or simply of the great gods. This is not folklore. It is documented across the colophon literature, cataloged by Hermann Hunger in 1968, and studied at length by Alan Lindsay in his book On Secrecy and the Gods, published in Helsinki in 2008. Working scholars 4,000 years ago wrote a classification level into the clay. They believed the knowledge they held had come down a chain, from the god of the deep, through the 7 sages, to them, and that some of it must never be seen by the wrong eyes. Now, the official explanation, at its strongest, because it is very strong. Every culture on Earth tells stories about limits. Scholars say, the forbidden fruit, Prometheus, Icarus, Pandora. The hubris tale is a human universal, because every society needs a story about why you should not reach too far. The me are a theological device for explaining why civilization looks the way it does. Berossus's nothing further discovered is the conservatism of a priestly class that measured value by antiquity. And the colophons are not cosmic security clearance. They are a guild protecting a monopoly. Cuneiform literacy was rare, lucrative, and jealously guarded. Of course, its practitioners wrote keep out on their manuals. As for reading modern technology into ancient texts, that is the oldest error in this entire genre, and it deserves to be called out. It is trivially easy to find a 4,000-year-old sentence that sounds like a rocket if you want one badly enough. That is the mainstream reading, and I want to be exact about how much of it I accept. Nearly all of it. So here is my frame, stated plainly, and I will state it again before the end. I am not claiming the Sumerians predicted technology. They did not. What they described was a boundary and a penalty. What this video does is describe what has been built across that boundary, with dates and citations, and let you sit with the shape of it. The uncanny thing is never the prophecy. The uncanny thing is the category. Because when you list the specific things Mesopotamian tradition marks as belonging to the gods and forbidden or withheld from men, a tower that reaches heaven, a maidservant that speaks, the fire that only heaven holds, life fashioned and switched on, the dead returned, the unspoken word inside a person, and the fixed limits of what a human being is allowed to be. You do not get a random list of ancient anxieties. You get, in almost perfect order, the frontier programs of the last 20 years. That is the road ahead. 7 of them. The tower first, because it is the oldest and the most literal, and because there is a real one going up in the desert right now, whose final height is deliberately being kept secret. Then the speaking servant. Then the sun. Then life, written from nothing. Then the dead. Then the 6th. The one that landed in a peer-reviewed journal in August of 2025, and whose parallel to that colophon clause is so exact that I had to go back and check the translation twice. And then the 7th, which is not finished, and which is funded, announced, and running on a 5-year plan. For each one, you get the text, the object, the official explanation at full strength, and the honest caveat. Because at least 2 of the 7 have been wildly overstated in the press. And I'm going to tell you precisely where the hype ends and the paper begins. If you have ever had the feeling that we are moving faster than anyone is steering, that things are being switched on before anyone finishes the sentence about whether they should be, then this video was made for you. Take 1 second and subscribe, because the algorithm buries content like this, and the rest of this series will not reach you otherwise. And stay with me, because the first one is a tower, and the oldest story about it does not end with the tower falling down. It ends with the builders being scattered, so they can never cooperate on that scale again. The tablet said it would happen, and it is happening. The first forbidden thing is a building. And I want to start here precisely because it is the least frightening item on this list, because it is the one you can walk up to and touch, and because the boundary it crosses is the only one in this entire video that has a surviving physical address. Go about 90 kilometers south of Baghdad to what is left of Babylon, and you will find a rectangular pit full of standing water. That pit is the foundation platform of a structure the Babylonians called Etemen Enki. The name is not decorative. It translates as the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. It was the ziggurat of Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, and it stood at the center of the city, the way a spine stands at the center of a body. Robert Koldewey, the German archaeologist who dug Babylon from 1913 onward, found the platform and the drainage channels and the brick stamps, and essentially nothing else, because the tower itself is gone. Not eroded, not collapsed under its own weight, but taken apart by human hands, more than once, deliberately. Now, most people watching this have heard of the Tower of Babel, and I need to be careful with that, because the careless version of this segment is the version that gets us dismissed. So let me state the scholarly position exactly. The book of Genesis, chapter 11, does not name Etemenanki. It does not name Babylon's ziggurat. It does not give a height. It does not give a builder. What most scholars think, and it is a strong, well-argued position, not a fringe one, is that the Genesis account is reacting to the Babylonian ziggurat tradition in general, and very probably to the enormous one at Babylon in particular, because that was the one everybody in the ancient Near East had heard of. The polite, accurate, on-air phrasing is this: Etemenanki is the structure most scholars associate with the Babel story, not the Tower of Babel. The structure the story is probably about. I will hold that line all the way through, and I would ask you to hold it with me, because the real object is stranger than the legend, and does not need the legend's help. Here is the real object, and here is where it gets specific in a way that ancient material almost never does. There is a cuneiform tablet in the Louvre in Paris with the catalog number AO 6555. Scholars call it the Esagil tablet, after the temple complex it describes. It was written at Uruk in the year 229 before Christ by a scribe whose name we have, Inu-Belshunu, and it is itself a copy of an older text, which is exactly how Mesopotamian scholarship worked, as we said in the setup. They did not write, they transmitted. It was first translated by George Smith in 1876, the same George Smith who found the Babylonian flood story, and, according to the story his colleagues told afterwards, began undressing in the reading room of the British Museum out of sheer excitement. And what this tablet does, in dry surveyor's language, is give you the dimensions of the tower. A square base of roughly 91 meters on each side, a height of roughly 91 meters, 7 stages, rising, with a temple on the top. And there is a second object, and I want to keep it strictly separate from the first, because the internet routinely mashes these two together, and I refuse to. The oldest surviving picture of the tower is not on the Esagil tablet. It is on a Blackstone stele in the Shoyan collection, catalogued as manuscript 2063, known as the Tower of Babel Stele. It is a monument of Nebuchadnezzar II, who reigned from 604 to 562 before Christ. It was broken into 3 pieces in antiquity, and it was brought to scholarly attention in 2003. And carved on it, in relief, is the terraced tower, stage upon stage, with Nebuchadnezzar himself standing beside it, holding his staff next to his own building. 2 different objects, different centuries, different purposes. One gives you the numbers, one gives you the face of the man who rebuilt it standing next to the thing he rebuilt. Now here's the 2 specific detail, and it is the reason this item opens the video instead of getting cut from it. The tablet says 91 meters. The engineers say that is impossible. A team led by Juan Luis Montero Fenolos has argued, on straightforward materials grounds, that the numbers on the Esagil tablet violate the compressive strength of mud brick. You cannot stack sun-dried and kiln-fired brick that high in that footprint without the lower courses failing under the mass above them. Their reconstruction gives you something closer to 54 meters for the ziggurat proper, plus perhaps another 12 for the temple on the summit. Call it 66 meters total. And the most careful scholarly treatment of the whole question. A.R. George's paper on the Tower of Babel in the journal Archiv für Orientforschung, Volume 51, published across 2005 and 2006, raises a possibility that I have not been able to stop thinking about since I read it. The possibility is that the texts are not describing the building that stood there. They may be describing the building as designed. Sit with what that means. If George is right, and he offers it as a possibility, not a finding, and I will not overstate it, then the number written on that tablet in the Louvre is not the height they reached. It is the height they meant to reach. It is a specification. It is the plan, preserved in clay, for a structure that the material world would not permit. Copied and recopied by scribes for 1,000 years after the thing itself had already been torn down. And it was torn down. Repeatedly. Sennacherib destroyed it in 689 before Christ. It was rebuilt under Esarhaddon, then Nabopolassar, then Nebuchadnezzar II, the man on the stele. And then Alexander the Great, arriving in Babylon, ordered it demolished so that he could rebuild it properly, and then died. And the rebuild never came. Which is how a structure that was the tallest thing most human beings of that world had ever seen ended up as a hole full of water. The reason we are still arguing about how tall it was is that somebody kept taking it down. And then there is the second half of the tower story, which is not about the bricks at all. It is about the mouths of the men who built it. There is a real Sumerian composition, cataloged as in Merkur and the Lord of Arata, and inside it, at lines 134 to 155, sits a passage scholars call the Spell of Nudimud. It describes a condition of the world in which there is no snake and no scorpion, no hyena and no lion, no dog and no wolf, no fear and no trembling, and in which all the lands, Shubur and Hamazi, and Sumer and Akkad and the Martu land, the whole well-guarded universe, address the god Enlil together in a single language, and it involves Enki changing the speech in the mouths of men. And here is where I have to be honest with you, because this passage is the site of one of the great translation wars of Assyriology, and the war itself is more interesting than either side of it. Samuel Noah Kramer, in 1968, in the Journal of the American Oriental Society, read those lines as the record of a lost golden age destroyed. Mankind once spoke one tongue, and Enki confused it. He explicitly offered it to the world as the Sumerian counterpart to Genesis 11, and that is the reading that dominates every popular book and every video on this subject. But Thorkild Jacobsen, and then Herman van Stifout, in his 2003 edition of the Sumerian Errata Epics, and the Oxford Electronic Corpus that most working scholars now use, read the same lines in the opposite direction entirely, as a blessing, a prophecy, a promise of a unity still to come, in which Enki will one day harmonize the many tongues so that all humanity speaks to Enlil in one pure speech. Van Stifout notes pointedly that the single language in that reading is not Sumerian. It is a divine speech that belongs to nobody. 20 lines, 2 serious readings. Scholars have described them as totally opposed, and I am not going to pick one for you, because I do not think the evidence lets me. What I will point out is the thing that survives both readings intact. In either translation, it is Enki who reaches into the mouths of men and changes what comes out of them. The disagreement is only about which direction he is turning the dial. So, that is the ancient side, a structure whose name means the foundation of heaven and earth. A tablet giving a height that the physics of mudbrick will not support, which may therefore record an intention rather than an achievement. A stele, showing the king standing next to it. A story in which the builders are stopped, and the thing that stops them is not a weapon or a flood, but an alteration to language itself. The sabotage of the single technology that lets large numbers of human beings cooperate on a large structure. Now come forward 4,000 years to a construction site on the Red Sea coast, north of Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. The tallest building in the world today is still the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, 828 meters, opened on the 4th of January, 2010. And as of this month, it remains the tallest freestanding structure of any kind on Earth. And I want to give you the skeptic's gift about the Burj before I go any further, because it is genuinely funny, and it tells you something about the psychology of this whole enterprise. 244 meters of that 828, 29% of the building, is classified by the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat as vanity height. That is a real technical term. It means unoccupiable spire, structure above the highest floor a human being can actually stand on, which is at 585 meters. Strip the vanity height off, and the Burj Khalifa beats the top usable floor of the Shanghai Tower by 2 meters. 2. The record for the tallest building on Earth is, to a surprising degree, an argument about where you are allowed to stop measuring. But the Burj is not the item. The item is the Jeddah Tower, and the Jeddah Tower is being built right now, while you watch this. Its official height, as stated by the developer, is at least 1,008 meters. Not 1,000. At least 1,008. And the exact final height is deliberately not being disclosed. The developer is keeping the number secret. Construction was halted in January of 2018 and sat frozen for 7 years. There was paperwork in 2023 and an architect's confirmation in 2024. But the concrete did not start moving again until January of 2025. On the 26th of April 2026, it passed 400 meters and the 100th floor. By the 8th of June 2026, it was past the 103rd. It is going up at roughly 4 meters a week. It is going up as I record this sentence, and it will be higher when you hear it than it was when I said it. So put the two numbers beside each other. Itamananki's own tablet claims 91 meters, and the engineers think the thing that actually stood there was closer to 66, which means the ancient number may be an ambition that the world refused to grant. In Jeddah, the number is a secret, and the floor beneath the secret is 11 times the height on the tablet. And the official explanation here is not just strong, it is almost entirely correct. So let me put it at full force. Ziggurats were not attempts to storm heaven. They were temple platforms, a staircase for the god to come down, not for men to go up. That is what the Assyriologists say, and they are right. Genesis 11 does not name Edamananki. The 91-meter figure comes from a Hellenistic-era tablet written 1,000 years after the original construction, which is roughly like taking a medieval monk's word for the dimensions of a Roman building. And the Jeddah Tower is not a theological project. It is a real estate development, financed for reasons that have nothing to do with Marduk. Every one of those points is true, and I accept all of them. And none of them touch the thing that is actually strange here, which is not a prophecy, but a category. Of all the human activities, the oldest literature on Earth chose to mark as the one that provoked a response. Not war, not murder, not blasphemy, but construction upward. We have spent the last 15 years doing that specific thing, at that specific scale, harder than any civilization in history, and the current record holder will not tell us how high it goes. The oldest story about a tower does not end with the tower falling down. It ends with the builders scattered and their speech changed, so that they could never again coordinate at that scale. In Jeddah, there is a tower going up right now, whose final height its owners refused to publish. They said men would build it. And we built it. The tablet said it would happen. And it is happening. 4 meters a week, this week, while you sit there. And I want to stress, because I promised I would state this plainly, and more than once. I am not claiming the Sumerians predicted the Jeddah Tower. They did not. There is no cuneiform text about Saudi Arabia. What the tablets describe is a boundary and a penalty, a line, and a consequence for crossing it. All I'm doing, for 7 items, is showing you what has been built on the far side of that line, with dates and citations, and letting you look at the shape. Because the tower is the easy one. The tower is stone and steel and a number on a permit. The second item on this list has no physical form at all, and 900 million people spoke to it this week. The second forbidden thing is a servant that was made rather than born, that has no life in it, and that answers when you speak to it. And to understand why this is on the list, why it belongs in the same category as a tower and a star and a resurrection, you have to go back to the single most important object in this entire video, which is not an object at all. It is a set of things called the me. We touched them in the setup. Now we go all the way in, because this is the frame that holds every remaining item. In Sumerian tradition, the god Enki lives in the Abzu, the freshwater deep beneath the earth, at the city of Eridu, the oldest city in their own reckoning, the first place kingship came down from heaven. And Enki holds in that place the me. English has no good word. They are not laws, because you do not obey a me. They are not objects, because you can hold 100 of them in a boat. They are not abstractions, because they can be stolen. The closest I can get is this. The me are the components of civilization, held as inventory. The composition that lists them is cataloged as Inanna and Enki, and I want to give you the reference number, because precision is the whole brand here. It is text 1.3.1 in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature at Oxford. Real Sumerian, old Babylonian manuscripts, not a modern reconstruction, not a channeled text, not an ancient astronaut paraphrase, an actual literary composition that actual scribes actually copied. And the story is this. Inanna, goddess of Uruk, travels down to Eridu, to Enki's house in the deep. Enki receives her as a host. They drink beer together out of bronze vessels. And Enki, drunk and expansive in the way that hosts get drunk and expansive, begins handing her the me, one after another, as gifts, and she takes them, all of them, loads them onto what the text calls the boat of heaven, and sails for Uruk. And then Enki sobers up. What he does next is the part that matters. He sends his minister, Isimud, after her, with the Enkum creatures and the Lahama sea monsters, to intercept the boat and take the me back. And Isimud catches her, and she refuses. So he is sent again, and again. 7 times, the text says. 7 interceptions. She keeps them all, and they arrive at Uruk, and that is why Uruk has civilization. Now, how many of these things are there? And here I have to be scrupulous, because this is where popular retellings inflate. The tablet is damaged. You will see confident numbers online. 100, 110, 94 exactly. The honest formulation, and it is Kramer's own, is this. Roughly 100, of which about 94 are still readable. That is the number. Anyone who gives you a precise figure is reading a broken tablet with more confidence than the tablet permits. And here is the detail that made me build this entire video around it. what is actually on the list. Kingship is on it, the royal throne, the great crown, the office of the end priest, wisdom, attentiveness, purification rites, all of that you might expect from a divine inventory. And then, in one segment of the text, you get a run of lines that are simply a list of trades. The craft of the carpenter, the craft of the coppersmith, the craft of the scribe, the craft of the smith, the craft of the leather worker, the craft of the fuller, the craft of the builder, the craft of the reed worker, metalworking, building, writing. In this tradition, those are not human inventions. They are issued items. They are stock. They sit in a locked room, under a god, at the bottom of the world, and the one time in the literature that they leave that room, they leave by theft. And the god sends monsters after them 7 times to get them back. That is the premise of this video in one object. Not that men are forbidden to build, that men were given the ability to build out of somebody else's inventory, under conditions. And the list is not sanitized, which is the part that convinces me it is not a later moralizing invention. Also on the me, according to the same text, strife, triumph, falsehood, the destruction of cities. Whoever composed this was not describing a gift basket. They were describing a complete operating system for a civilization, with the failure modes shipped in the same box. Now hold the me in one hand, and take this in the other. There is another Sumerian composition, cataloged 1.4.1, called Inanna's Descent to the Netherworld. Inanna goes down into the underworld, is judged, is killed, and her corpse is hung on a hook. And Enki, the same Enki, in the same deep, decides to retrieve her. And the way he does it is the reason this segment exists. The text describes him taking dirt from underneath his fingernail. Dirt. Not clay, I want to be exact, because the clay version is a popular embellishment, and the actual word is more unsettling than the embellishment. From the dirt under his own fingernail, at lines 217 through 225, he fashions 2 beings, the Kurgara and the Galatur. He gives one of them the life-giving plant and the other the life-giving water. He gives them a script, precise instructions on what to say and how to behave in front of the queen of the underworld. And he sends them down into a place from which nothing living returns. There is a detail here that gets mangled constantly, and I am going to give you the careful version. You will hear it said that the tablet describes these 2 beings as neither male nor female. That crisp phrasing comes from Wolkstein and Kramer's 1983 popular book on Inanna, not from a literal clause in the Sumerian. The corpus gives no gender description, but the underlying point is completely sound, and here is why. The Kurgara and the Gala were real cult performers in the worship of Inanna and Ishtar, and Mesopotamian sources genuinely associate them with ambiguous or transgressed gender. That is precisely why the myth reaches for them. A being that stands outside the normal categories can pass into a place where categorized living things cannot go. So the accurate on-air sentence is this: cult figures who stood outside the normal categories of male and female. Not sexless robots. Something stranger and better attested. Strip the myth down to its mechanism and look at what you have. A craftsman takes inert material. He shapes it into 2 agents. He loads them with instructions. He sends them somewhere no living thing can survive, to perform a task on his behalf and to bring something back. That is the oldest description in human literature of a purpose-built, non-living agent executing a task for its maker. And there is one more piece, because it is the piece that makes the second item terrifying rather than merely clever. The Babylonian creation poem, Enuma Elish. The title is just its first 2 words, when on high runs 7 tablets and roughly 1,100 lines. It opens by telling you that heaven above had not been named, and the firm ground below had not been called by name. That is the condition of the world before creation, not empty, unnamed. And in standard Assyriological reading, that is not poetry. In this tradition, the unnamed is the not yet existent. Ordered reality begins with nomination. Things come into being by being called. And in Tablet 4, before the battle with Tiamat, the assembled gods hold an audition. They need to know whether Marduk is fit to be king. So they put an object among them, and they tell him to destroy it and recreate it by his word alone. He speaks, and it vanishes. He speaks again, and it comes back, restored. And the gods proclaim, Marduk is king, and they hand him the scepter and the throne. One precision note, because I said I would never overstate. The object is a garment, Akkadian lumashu. The word can also mean a constellation, and translators genuinely split on it, but Foster and most current translations render it garment. And I will not tell you that Marduk made a constellation disappear when the best current reading is that he made a piece of cloth disappear. It does not matter for the argument. What matters is the credential. The single qualification Babylon's chief god had to demonstrate in order to be made king of the universe was this: speak, and a thing ceases to exist. Speak again, and it returns. The word that makes and unmakes. Language as the executive instrument of reality. Hold that. Now come forward. On the 30th of November, 2022, a research organization in San Francisco put a text box on a website. You typed into it, and something typed back. The famous claim about what happened next is that it reached 100 million users in 2 months, faster than anything in history. And I want to attribute that properly, because it is the kind of number that gets repeated for years without anybody checking its parentage. That figure traces to an analyst note from UBS, reported by Reuters on the 1st of February, 2023, built on similar web data showing roughly 13 million unique daily visitors that January. OpenAI never confirmed it. SimilarWeb measures website visits, not people, and the record, such as it was, fell within 5 months, when Threads launched and took 100 million signups in under 5 days. So the honest sentence is, by most estimates, about 100 million people in 2 months, a figure that came from an analyst note, not from the company. Here's the number that is not an estimate. On the 27th of February, 2026, OpenAI itself stated 900 million weekly active users, 50 million paying subscribers, announced alongside a $110 billion raise at a $730 billion pre-money valuation. The trajectory from their own disclosures: 100 million weekly in November 2023, 700 million by July 2025, 800 million by that October, 900 million this past February. 900 million people in a week, speaking to a made thing and receiving answers. And there is a scientific result here that I have to give you with its caveat attached, because it is genuinely striking and genuinely limited. Cameron Jones and Benjamin Bergen in the Department of Cognitive Science at the University of California, San Diego, ran a standard 3-party Turing test. A human judge talking simultaneously to a human and to a machine, trying to identify which is which. Their paper was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Volume 123, Issue 21, this year. Across roughly 1,000 games with a few hundred participants, a persona-prompted version of GPT 4.5 was judged to be the human 73% of the time, not merely passing, chosen as the human more often than the actual humans were. Now the caveat, at full strength, because this is exactly where a channel like this loses its credibility if it flinches. Without the persona prompt, the same model collapses to about 36%. So this is a result about prompting, not about raw capability. The conversations lasted 5 minutes. The interrogators were laypeople, not experts. And the authors themselves are explicit that what they measured is substitutability, not intelligence. Whether a machine can occupy a human's conversational seat, not whether anything is happening inside it. All of that is true, and I want it on the record. And now, the too specific detail. This is the hinge of the entire video, and I am planting it here so that I can detonate it at number 6. In May of 2020, a team at OpenAI published a paper on the preprint server ARF, number 2005.14165, titled Language Models Are Few-Shot Learners. It described GPT-3, and it told you, in plain text, how big the thing was. 175 billion parameters. Architecture, training approach, scale. All of it in public for anyone to read. Then, in March of 2023, the same organization published the GPT-4 technical report. And that document explicitly declines to tell you the model size. It declines to tell you the architecture. It declines to tell you the hardware, the training compute, or the dataset. And it gives a reason, which I want to quote in substance because it is remarkable. The competitive landscape and the safety implications of large-scale models. Every frontier model built since carries the same silence. GPT-5, the Claude models, Gemini. You will find numbers for GPT-4 circulating on the internet, and I want to be extremely clear about their status. Those figures come from unconfirmed leaks. They have never been confirmed by anybody in a position to confirm them, and I am not going to state them as fact, because I do not know them, and neither does anyone repeating them. So here is where we actually stand. The last frontier model whose size we are permitted to know is GPT-3, and GPT-3 is now 6 years old. Everything built since sits behind a clause that says you may not see inside it. 4,000 years ago in Nineveh, a scholar finished copying a tablet, and at the bottom of it, he wrote an access restriction. Let the one who knows show the one who knows. The one who does not know may not see. And in many cases, he added a word, ikib, abomination, taboo, of Anu and Enlil, or of Nabu, or of the great gods. Those scholars had a technical term for the class of knowledge this applied to. Pirishtu, secret. The recurring phrase is Pirishti Ilani Rabuti, the secret of the great gods. They classified it as a secret of the great gods. OpenAI classifies it as the competitive landscape. I am not saying those are the same institution or the same motive. One is a Neo-Assyrian guild protecting a theology. The other is a corporation protecting a market position and, by its own account, a risk surface. But the artifact is identical. It is a document produced by the most advanced knowledge workers of its civilization, describing the most powerful thing that civilization can make, with a clause at the bottom saying, "Not for you." A thing with no life in it, fashioned by a craftsman out of nothing, given a script, sent somewhere you cannot go, that answers when you address it. 900 million people spoke to one this week. They said men would build it. And we built it. The tablet said it would happen. And it is happening. And then we did the other thing the tradition warned about, which is that we sealed the box. And I want you to hold the shape of that sealed box in your mind for the next 4 items. Because when we get to the 6th one, the box is going to be a human skull. Because the 3rd thing is older than the tower and older than the servant. The 3rd thing is the one power that in every mythology on Earth, and not just this one, is never given to men. The 3rd forbidden thing is fire that does not belong to the earth. And I want to handle the ancient side of this one carefully, because this is the item where it would be easiest to cheat. There is no Sumerian tablet about nuclear fusion. There is no cuneiform text describing a star being lit in a laboratory. If I told you there was, I would be doing exactly what the mainstream critics of this entire genre accuse us of doing, and they would be right. What there is the me, again. Go back to Enki's inventory in the Abzu. Roughly 100 powers, about 94 still readable, held in a locked room under a god, retrieved by force when they leave. Now ask a simple question about that list. What is not on it? The list gives men the craft of the smith. It gives them the craft of the builder. It gives them kingship, priesthood, the scribal art, wisdom, purification, and, remarkably, strife and falsehood, and the destruction of cities. The inventory of the me is astonishingly complete. It covers the making of metal, and the making of law, and the making of war. It does not hand over the sky. The powers that run the heavens, the ones that make the sun move and burn, are never issued. In the Mesopotamian division of labor that stays upstairs, the sun is Utu, or Shamash. He is a god with a name and a chariot and a court, not a resource. The fire that runs the sky is the one thing that is not on the manifest. And beside that, put Marduk's audition again, the credential from Enuma Elish Tablet 4. Speak, and the thing ceases to exist. Speak again, and it returns. Command over the existence of matter itself, demonstrated in front of witnesses, as the qualifying examination for the kingship of the universe. Not strength, not courage. The ability to unmake and remake a thing by directed will. That is the register. Now let me tell you what happened in a bunker in California. The National Ignition Facility sits inside the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, run by the Department of Energy through the National Nuclear Security Administration. It is, physically, a building about the size of 3 football fields, most of which is laser. 192 beamlines, converging on a chamber at the center. In that chamber, they place a cylinder about the size of a pencil eraser, and inside that cylinder, a spherical capsule about the size of a peppercorn, containing deuterium and tritium, 2 heavy forms of hydrogen. The lasers fire. Not for a second, for a few billionths of a second. The X-rays generated inside the cylinder crush the capsule inward at hundreds of kilometers per second, compressing that peppercorn of hydrogen to densities and temperatures higher than the center of the sun. And on the 5th of December, 2022, announced 8 days later on the 13th by the United States Energy Secretary, that peppercorn did something no controlled fusion experiment had ever done in the history of the human species. 2.05 megajoules of laser energy went in. 3.15 megajoules of fusion energy came out. More came out than went in. The reaction gave back more than it was given. Scientific break-even. The thing physicists had been chasing since the 1950s. The thing that had been famously 30 years away for 70 years. Happened in a room in California on a Monday. And it is not a press release. It went through peer review. Abu Shawareb and colleagues, in physical review letters, in 2024. They have done considerably better since. On the 30th of July, 2023, 3.88 megajoules, a gain of about 1.9. On the 23rd of February, 2025, 5 megajoules, a gain of 2.44. And then, on the 7th of April, 2025, the current record as I make this, 8.6 megajoules of fusion energy, plus or minus about 0.45 out of 2.08 megajoules in, driven by a 456 terawatt pulse. A target gain of 4.13, more than 4 times out what went in. The enabling change was a capsule made of high-density carbon, which is to say, diamond, with continuously graded doping through its shell. We made a star for 4 billionths of a second, 4 times over. And now I owe you the caveat, and this is the one where I most want your attention, because I am about to take a large part of that achievement away, and I want you to understand that I am not doing it to be clever. I am doing it because the honest version of this story is more frightening than the inflated one, and that is the house rule on this channel. That 2.05 megajoules is the energy delivered to the target. It is not the energy the facility consumed. To put 2 megajoules onto that peppercorn, NIF's laser system drew on the order of 300 megajoules from the electrical grid. NEF's flash lamp-driven lasers are roughly 1% efficient, so the facility gain, the wall plug gain, the number that would matter to an electricity company, is on the order of 1%. The experiment produced about 1/100th of the energy it consumed. It gets worse, and I mean that as a compliment to the difficulty of the problem. NIF fires roughly once per day at its very best. A working power plant would need something like 10 shots per second. Each target is a precision-manufactured object that costs tens of thousands of dollars and is annihilated in the process. And the whole facility exists primarily to simulate the physics of nuclear weapons without detonating them. The energy research is, institutionally, a passenger. So, this is target gain, not net energy. Fusion power is not here. Anyone who told you the energy problem was solved in December of 2022 was selling you something. And while we are being precise, let me disentangle 2 results that get merged constantly. In January of 2025, the 20th to be exact, the East Tokamak at the Institute of Plasma Physics in Hefei, China, sustained a high confinement plasma for 1,066 seconds at around 100 million degrees, breaking its own 403-second record from 2023. That is a genuinely extraordinary engineering achievement. It is also a confinement duration record that produced 0 net energy. It measures how long you can hold the fire, not how much the fire gives back. These are different numbers about different problems, and they do not add together. And ITER, the international reactor in France that is supposed to settle the question, was rebaselined in July of 2024. Full plasma current pushed to 2034. Deuterium-tritium operations to 2039, with roughly 5 billion euros of additional cost. Now, hold the honest version up against the tablet, because the honest version is the one that fits. 192 lasers, a target the size of a peppercorn, a few billionths of a second, temperatures beyond the core of the sun, 300 megajoules pulled off the electrical grid of the state of California to put 2 megajoules onto a grain to get 8.5 back. We lit it, and we cannot carry it. We can produce the fire that belongs to the sky, and we cannot yet hold it, or feed it, or afford it. We reached the one item that was never on the manifest. We touched it, and it cost us 100 times what it gave. For 4,000 years, the one power the texts never put into human hands was the fire that runs the sun. In December of 2022, in a bunker in California, we made a star for 4 billionths of a second, and then we did it 4 times better. They said men would build it, and we built it. The tablet said it would happen, and it is happening, and it is still costing us 100 times what it returns, which is exactly what you would expect from a thing that was never issued to us in the first place. And I want to say the frame again, because I promised twice, and this is the second time. I am not claiming any Sumerian scribe foresaw a laser. Nobody foresaw a laser. What the text described is a division, a list of what was handed down, and, by its silence, a list of what was kept. We are simply walking the second list, item by item, and noting what has been built. Now, before the fourth one, and it is the one where this stops being about things and starts being about beings. Take 1 second and do the thing that keeps this channel alive. If you have made it this far, you already know that this is not the usual version of this subject. There is no channeled wisdom here, no ancient astronauts, no invented quotations. Every object I have named has a museum number or a catalog entry, and every modern claim has a journal, a volume, and a date, and where the press overstated something, I have told you exactly where. That is a slower kind of video to make, and the algorithm does not reward slow. It rewards certainty, and I am not going to give you certainty I do not have, which means the only way the next one reaches you is if you subscribe. Genuinely, one tap. Because this material sits in exactly the category the recommendation system quietly decides you did not need to see. Do it now, while I still have your attention, because the fourth thing is alive. It is in a dish. It is dividing tonight, and a third of it is a mystery to the men who wrote it. The fourth forbidden thing is a living organism, written down, letter by letter, and then switched on. Go back to Enki, one more time, and to the dirt under his fingernail. I want you to notice what kind of act that is, because we skipped past it quickly, and it deserves its own examination. When Enki needs two agents to go somewhere, no living thing can go. He does not summon them. He does not call up a spirit or borrow a lesser god. He takes material, inert, unremarkable material, the dirt lodged under a fingernail, and he specifies a being out of it. And then he loads it with instructions, and it works. That is not magic in the way we usually mean it. That is fabrication. That is a specification problem. The god's power in that scene is not that he can violate physics. It is that he knows exactly what to say over a piece of dirt to make it into a functioning agent. And that fits perfectly with the other thing this tradition believes about how existence works, which is Enuma Elish. The poem opens on a world where heaven above has not been named, and the ground below has not been called by name. And in the standard Assyriological reading, the unnamed is simply the not yet existent. To bring a thing into being is to name it correctly, and the poem is structured around that idea, with a rigor that I find genuinely beautiful. It begins with nothing named at all, and it ends across tablets 6 and 7, with Marduk being given 50 names. 50, which is the number belonging to Enlil. The count itself is the transfer of supremacy. The poem does not describe Marduk taking over. It performs it by nomenclature. So in this tradition, making a living thing is not a miracle of substance. It is a problem of specification. Get the writing right, and the thing exists. On the 20th of May, 2010, in the journal Science, volume 329, a team led by Daniel Gibson at the J. Craig Venter Institute published a paper with the title, Creation of a Bacterial Cell Controlled by a Chemically Synthesized Genome. What they had done was this. They took the genome of a bacterium, Mycoplasma mycoides, about 1,080,000 base pairs of DNA, and they did not copy it biologically. They wrote it, chemically, from bottles of the 4 nucleotides, assembled in overlapping fragments, stitched together in yeast, and then transplanted into a related bacterial cell, Mycoplasma capricolum, whose own genome had been removed, and the cell booted up. It began expressing the synthetic instructions instead of any natural ones, and then it divided, and its daughters divided, and within a few generations, every molecule in the population descended from a sequence that had been sitting in a computer file. Roughly $40 million, roughly 200 person years of work, called at the time JCVI-SYN-1-point-0. Now here is the honest correction, and it is mandatory, and I want it in before the awe rather than after it. This was not life created from scratch. Only the genome was synthesized, and the genome that was synthesized was a near copy of an existing natural one. They did not design a novel organism. They retyped an old one, and it was installed into a pre-existing living cell that supplied absolutely everything else. The cytoplasm, the ribosomes, the membrane, the entire running machinery of being alive. Nothing was made from non-living chemistry. The word people reached for at the time was synthetic cell, and it was criticized as overhyped by working biologists for exactly that reason. And the criticism was fair. What Venter's team built was not a creature. It was an operating system, retyped from a listing and booted on existing hardware. And with that stated, let me tell you what they did next, because it is the single best image in this entire video, and it is completely true. They signed it, encoded into the synthetic genome itself, written into the DNA of a living dividing organism in a substitution cipher of their own devising, were 4 watermark messages. The first was an HTML message congratulating whoever managed to decode it, containing an email address so that you could write to them and say that you had found it. The second was the list of the names of the people who had built it, followed by a line from James Joyce: to live, to err, to fall, to triumph, to recreate life out of life. The third was a line from Robert Oppenheimer: see things not as they are, but as they might be. And the fourth was from Richard Feynman: what I cannot build, I cannot understand. 2 details about that, and they are both real, and together they tell you more about the species than any amount of philosophy. The first is that they got the Feynman quote wrong. What Feynman actually wrote on his blackboard was, what I cannot create, I do not understand. The team misquoted him inside the genome of a living organism and had to correct it in later constructs. The second is that the Joyce estate reportedly objected to the unlicensed use of the line. So, men wrote their own names into the interior of a living thing, misquoted the physicist while doing it, and got a letter from a lawyer. If you wanted one scene that captures the exact texture of the human race arriving at a boundary, that is it. 6 years later came the number that actually carries this segment. On the 25th of March, 2016, in Science, volume 351, Clyde Hutchison III and colleagues published JCVY-Sin-3-Point-0. This time the goal was not to copy a genome, it was to find the floor, the absolute minimum set of genes required for an organism to live and reproduce. They stripped and tested and stripped again, cycle after cycle, until removing anything else killed it. The floor is 531,560 base pairs, 473 genes. It is the smallest genome of any known self-replicating organism that has ever existed, natural or made. And of those 473 genes, 149 are of unknown biological function. I want to give you that as a fraction, because the fraction is the point. That is about 31.5%, very nearly a third. And I note, because precision is the whole product here, that a figure of 17% circulates online, and it is wrong. We built the smallest possible living thing. We chose every single component ourselves, deliberately, by elimination, over years. It is the most thoroughly specified organism in the history of the planet, and we cannot say what a third of it is doing. They are essential. We know that because removing them kills the cell. They are required, and their function is unknown. There is a life form on a bench right now, dividing, whose blueprint we wrote, containing 149 instructions we cannot read and dare not delete. The work has continued honestly, and I will give the state of it accurately. There is a workhorse strain, JCVI-Sin-3-A, about 543,000 base pairs, 493 genes, with 19 genes added back because the stripped version had a problem. And the problem is worth describing because it is beautiful. Sin 3.0 could not divide properly. Under video microscopy, it produced grotesque, irregular masses. It replicated, but it did not divide cleanly into normal cells. In a paper in Cell on the 29th of March, 2021, Pelletier and colleagues at the Venter Institute, with the National Institute of Standards and Technology and MIT, identified 7 genes whose restoration returned the cell to normal division. 7 genes stood between a minimal organism and the ordinary competence of every bacterium on Earth, and we had removed them without knowing what they did. And there is a parallel effort in yeast, and here again I will give you the disciplined version rather than the exciting one. SC 2.0 is an international project. More than 250 researchers, about 15 years, led out of NYU Langone by Jeff Boak, with Manchester, Edinburgh, Tianjin, and BGY, to rebuild every chromosome of baker's yeast from synthetic DNA. On the 8th of November, 2023, they published a package of 10 papers across cell, molecular cell, and cell genomics, reporting the synthesis and debugging of the remaining chromosomes, plus an entirely artificial extra chromosome carrying the transfer RNA genes. One strain in that work carried more than 50% synthetic DNA and grew at close to normal rates. Every chromosome has now been individually built. But, and this matters, as of today, they have not all been combined into a single, fully synthetic yeast cell. That is the step that remains. Anybody telling you a fully synthetic eukaryote exists is ahead of the evidence, and I am not going to be that person. So here's where we stand on the fourth thing. We can write a genome from chemicals. We can install it in an emptied cell and switch it on. We can find the minimum viable specification of life, and we can build organisms down at that floor. And when we do, a third of the specification is opaque to us, and we discovered by accident that we had deleted the ability to divide. In this tradition, making a living thing is a matter of specifying it correctly, and existence begins with naming. They wrote a living thing down, letter by letter, and switched it on, and then wrote their own names inside it, the way a scribe signs the bottom of a tablet, and misquoted a physicist while doing it. They said men would build it, and we built it. The tablet said it would happen, and it is happening, except that we cannot read a third of what we ourselves wrote. And that is the last item on this list that we unambiguously succeeded at. Because the fifth one we announced, and then we took it back. The fifth forbidden thing is the dead, brought back. And this is the item where I have to work hardest to keep you, because the honest version is going to sound, at first, like a debunk. Stay with it, because it is not a debunk. It is the item on this list where the boundary actually held, and that turns out to be far more interesting than another success. The tablets first. We left Inanna hanging on a hook in the underworld, and Enki making 2 beings out of the dirt under his fingernail. Here's how that ends. The Kurgara and the Galador go down. They do not fight anything. They do not steal anything. What they do, and the text is very specific about this, is sympathize. Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld, is in agony, moaning, and the 2 made things echo her cries back to her, and she is so disarmed by being commiserated with that she offers them a gift. And they refuse everything she offers, exactly as Enki instructed them, and ask for one thing, the corpse hanging on the hook. And they are given it. And they apply what Enki gave them to carry, the life-giving plant and the life-giving water. And Inanna rises. Note the conditions. The resurrection happens exactly once. It requires the direct personal intervention of a god. It requires beings that the god manufactures himself for that single purpose, out of his own body. And it requires a scripted deception, performed flawlessly. There is no procedure here that a human being could run. And then, beside it, put Gilgamesh. The standard edition is AR, George's 2-volume Babylonian Gilgamesh epic from Oxford, 2003. In Tablet 11, Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, tells Gilgamesh about a plant that grows on the floor of the Apsu, the freshwater deep. Gilgamesh ties stones to his feet, sinks, and takes it. The text describes it as being like a boxthorn, whose thorns prick the hand the way a rose does. And Gilgamesh names it. The name he gives it, and the text treats this as its actual title is, "The old man has become a young man. He has it." The reversal of aging in his hand, retrieved from the bottom of the world at enormous personal cost. And on the road home, he stops at a pool to bathe and sets it down. And a snake, drawn by the scent, takes it and goes, sloughing its skin as it leaves. And Gilgamesh sits down and weeps. So the tradition's position on raising the dead and reversing age is exact and consistent. It is possible. It is real. It is done by gods through manufactured servants, and it is never once completed by a human being. The rejuvenation plant is taken before any man uses it. Now, on the 7th and 8th of April, 2025, a company called Colossal Biosciences announced to the world that it had brought back the dire wolf. 3 animals, 2 males, Romulus and Remus, born on the 1st of October, 2024. A female, Khaleesi, born on the 30th of January, 2025. The dire wolf has been extinct for roughly 10,000 years. The coverage was enormous, and it was on the cover of a magazine, and the animals are white, and they are photographed in snow. Here is what was actually done. 20 edits across 14 genes made in cells taken from a gray wolf, specifically endothelial progenitor cells from Canis lupus. Of those 20 changes, 15 were derived from the dire wolf genome. 5 were for coat color. Loss of function edits in 2 genes, MC1R and MFSD12, which produce the white coat. No dire wolf DNA was inserted into these animals. None. The ancient DNA was used only as a reference, a document consulted to decide which letters of the gray wolf's own genome to change. Colossal identified roughly 80 genes showing the largest differences between dire and gray wolves, and edited 14 of them. And now, the arithmetic, which is the beat that makes this segment. Dire wolves are not a kind of wolf. They are Enochion, and they sit in their own genus. Perry and colleagues, in Nature, on the 13th of January, 2021, showed that they diverged from living canids around 5.7 million years ago. That is the Perry point estimate. Some sources give a range from 2.5 to 6 million. That they are genetically closer to jackals than to gray wolves, and that there is no evidence of gene flow between dire wolves and gray wolves or coyotes at all. They are not a lost breed. They are a separate branch that has been separate since before our own ancestors came out of the trees. Colossal states that the genomes are 99.5% identical. Fine, take that at face value. 99.5% identity across a canid. Genome still leaves on the order of 12,235,000 individual differences. 20 edits against 12 million differences. And the scientific community said so, immediately and loudly. And I'm going to give you their actual words, because they are more precise than anything I could write. Vincent Lynch at the University at Buffalo. This is not a dire wolf by any reasonable definition of a dire wolf. This is a gray wolf that has had a tiny fraction of its genes modified to look more like what they think a dire wolf looked like. He also called the campaign a semantic house of cards. Anders Bergstrom at the University of East Anglia. It is a modified gray wolf. 20 changes is not nearly enough, but it could get you a strange-looking gray wolf. Nick Rollins at Otago pointed out that dire wolf ancient DNA is an extremely fragmentary source. Jeremy Austin at the Australian Centre for Ancient DNA was blunter. Not a dire wolf under any definition of a species ever. And the paleontologist Marin Balisi made the observation that I cannot get out of my head because it is about the pictures. Dire wolves were most abundant around the La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles. Not, as she put it, a snowy landscape, even in the Ice Age. The white coat, the signature look, the thing on every thumbnail and every magazine cover is probably wrong. Those 5 color edits were not reconstruction. They were art direction. The IUCN Species Survival Commission's Canid Specialist Group, the actual international body of canid experts, issued a statement saying, the animals are neither dire wolves nor valid ecological proxies for them, and that the project does not contribute to conservation. And then came the beat that makes this the strongest single item in the video, and it did not come from a critic, it came from inside. Beth Shapiro is Colossal's own chief science officer. She is a serious ancient DNA scientist with a serious record. In April of 2025, on the record, she said, "It is a dire wolf." And then, in the same breath, and this is the part that tells you she knew exactly what she was doing. She added that she felt like she says that, and then all of her taxonomist friends will be done with her. But, she said, it is not a gray wolf. It does not look like a gray wolf. That is an appeal to a morphological species concept. The idea that what a thing looks like is what a thing is. By May of 2025, she had conceded that the animals are gray wolves with 20 edits, and that dire wolf was a colloquialism rather than a scientific term. 6 weeks. From it is a dire wolf to gray wolves with 20 edits. From the chief science officer of the company that made the announcement. And I want to be scrupulously fair here, because the underlying technical work is real, and I will not pretend otherwise. Multiplex germline editing at that scale in a large mammal, followed by cloning and successful live births of healthy animals, is a genuine engineering achievement. The company's woolly mouse, announced on the 4th of March 2025, was 8 edits across 7 genes using 3 different editing techniques, producing mice with roughly 5 centimeter golden brown woolly coats. A real demonstration of editing throughput, though what it tests is mouse hair genetics, not mammoth biology. Their avian work is arguably better. On the 17th of September 2025, their team cultured pigeon primordial germ cells for the first time ever, after testing more than 300 growth factor combinations. That is a genuine world first, and it is unglamorous, and it got a fraction of the coverage the wolves got. But notice the pattern, because it is unbroken. Every one of those announcements landed as an unreviewed preprint on the day of the press release. The press release comes first. The paper comes after, if at all. And their headline projection, a mammoth calf in late 2028 with first embryos by the end of this year, is a company projection and not an achievement. And the company's own chief executive has said the bottleneck is not the editing, but the surrogacy. They need Asian elephants, which are themselves endangered, with a 22-month gestation, and no elephant has ever carried an edited embryo. A late 2028 calf requires implantation by roughly early next year. And the money, because the money is part of the story. $615 million raised, a valuation of $10.32 billion, Texas's first decacorn. Among the named investors, Peter Jackson, who filmed Dire Wolves, and George R.R. Martin, who invented them. Martin said of the animals that it stirred him as no scientific news had since Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. So the true shape of the 5th item is this: a company valued at over $10 billion, whose flagship public achievement is 3 genetically modified gray wolves, counting among its investors the novelist who invented the fictional version of the animal and the director who put it on screen. The tablets let the dead come back exactly once, and only because a god made two servants out of the dirt under his own fingernail and sent them down himself. And even then, the rejuvenation plant was stolen by a snake before any human being used it. 4,000 years later, a company worth $10 billion announced that it had done it, and its own chief scientist took it back inside 6 weeks. They said men would try to build it, and we tried. And here, for the first and only time on this list, we could not do it, and we announced it anyway. The tablet said it would happen, and it is happening in the strangest possible form, not as a resurrection, but as a press release about one. And I want you to see why this item belongs here rather than being cut, because I can hear the objection. The objection is, you just spent 15 minutes debunking your own item. No, I spent 15 minutes showing you the one place on this list where the boundary held. Items 1 through 4 are things we actually did. This is the item where we stood at the line and could not cross it, and said we had, which is the perfect setup for what comes next. And I need to tell you what is coming, because it changes the character of this entire video. There is no announcement gap in the 6th one. There is no company, no valuation, no press release ahead of the paper, no chief scientist walking it back 6 weeks later. The 6th thing was published in a peer-reviewed journal by an academic consortium, with the caveats stated by the authors themselves in the paper. Nobody oversold it. Nobody needed to. And its parallel to the tablets is not thematic or poetic or approximate. It is exact. It is the same clause, the same restriction, the same fear, 4,000 years apart, arrived at independently by Assyrian scribes and by neuroscientists at Stanford, and implemented, in both cases, as a lock. So this is the moment. If you are going to subscribe, do it now, in the next 3 seconds, before I tell you what the 6th thing is. Not because I need the number, because this specific segment, the one about what can now be extracted from the interior of a conscious human being, is precisely the kind of material the recommendation system quietly decides is not for you. It will not be flagged. It will not be removed. It will simply stop being shown, and you will never know it existed, which is a distinctly modern version of a very old idea about who is permitted to see what. Subscribing is the only mechanism you have to override that. One tap. Do it. Because the 6th thing is the one in the title. And the 6th thing is the word inside a man, read out loud, without his mouth moving. I need to build the ancient side of this one properly, because if I rush it, you will not feel what happens when the two halves meet. Everything so far in this video has been myth, beautifully preserved, carefully cataloged, seriously studied myth, but myth. Gods in a freshwater deep, a goddess on a hook, a tower in a story. What I'm about to describe is not myth. It is the professional practice of a real class of working scholars, documented on thousands of physical objects in museum collections you can visit. Mesopotamian scholarship was organized into disciplines. There was the Baru, the diviner, who read the future in the liver of a sacrificed sheep and in the movement of the sky. There was the Ashipu, the exorcist, the incantation specialist, who handled the interface between a patient and whatever was afflicting them. There was the ASU, the physician of plants and poultices and bones. These were credentialed men, attached to courts and temples, at the top of the intellectual hierarchy of their civilization. They were the equivalent of a research faculty, and when one of them finished copying a tablet, he wrote a colophon at the bottom. A colophon is the scribal signature block, who copied it, from what original, for whom, when, and sometimes why. The foundational reference work on these is Hermann Hunger's Babylonische und Assyrische Kolophone, published in 1968, And the modern study that matters most for our purposes is Alan Lindsay's Secrecy and the Gods, Volume 19 of the State Archives of Assyria Studies series, published in Helsinki in 2008. There is also Alastair Livingstone's Oxford volume from 1986 on the mystical and explanatory works of Assyrian and Babylonian scholars. This is mainstream, uncontroversial Assyriology. Nobody is on the fringe here. And what a great many of those colophons contain, on real tablets, largely from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, is an access restriction. The classification vocabulary is technical and consistent. Pirishtu means secret. The recurring phrase is Pirishti Ilani Rabuti, the secret of the great gods. Nisirtu means a guarded thing, a treasure, something withheld. And Nisirti Baruti, the secret of extispacy, is attested particularly on tablets from Ashurbanipal's collection. A Mudu is one who knows, an initiate. Alamudu is one who does not know. And Ikib is a taboo, an abomination, a forbidden thing, and the formula in the rendering I will use throughout. Mudu muda likalam, lamudu I emur. Let the one who knows show the one who knows. The one who does not know may not see. I want to be careful about one thing, because this is where popular treatments overreach. There is no single fixed universal wording. This is a family of formulas, and the taboo clause names different gods on different tablets. On an astrological tablet from Ashurbanipal's library, you get, in substance, let the knowing instruct the knowing, and let him who does not know not read. That is an abomination unto Anu and Enlil. On an extispacy tablet you get, it is the secret of the diviners. Let the knowing teach the knowing, and he that does not know shall not read. For that is an abomination unto Nabu and Lugal. Sometimes it is the great gods, generically. Sometimes it is Marduk, or Ea. It is a genre, not a boilerplate. I will not pretend to a uniformity that does not exist. But the function is uniform, and the function is the point. This is an access control clause. It is a classification stamp. And it does not say, do not steal this tablet. There were separate curses for theft, and they exist too. It says, do not let the wrong person read it. It says the act of an uninitiated person seeing this information is not merely against the rules. It is an abomination against gods with names. And Lindsay's central thesis explains why they believed that, and it braids everything in this video together. Those scholars held that their knowledge did not originate with them. They believed it had come down a chain, from the gods, through Ea in particular, to the 7 Apkallu, the antediluvian sages, and from the Apkallu to the human scholars, the Umanu, and from them, generation by generation, to the man holding the tablet. Lindsay calls this the mythology of scribal succession, and there is a real cuneiform document that lays out precisely this claim. The Uruk list of kings and sages, excavation number W 20030, 7, recovered from the Bit Resh temple of Anu at Uruk in the German excavations of the 1959 and 60 season, published by Van Dyck in 1962. It pairs each antediluvian king with his sage, and there is a detail in that document which I find more moving than anything else in this material, and which corrects the popular version. The sages were not simply withdrawn after the flood. The list records a degradation. Fully divine sages before the flood. Then, after it, 4 part-human sages, Nungal Pirigaldim, Pirigalnungal, Pirigalabsu, and Lunana, who is described as being only 2/3 Apkallu. And then merely human scholars, the Ummanu, men. The channel did not close, it thinned. And the men at the far, thin end of it believed they were the last custodians of a transmission that was running out, and they wrote a lock into the clay to protect what was left. That is the image. A physical object, 4,000 years old, in a museum, with an access restriction baked into the bottom of it, not a metaphor, a clay tablet with a line on it saying, in effect, "The one who does not know may not see this, and looking is an abomination to the great gods." They believed the last defensible boundary of knowledge was the surface of a tablet, and they protected it with a curse. Now let me tell you what happened on the 14th of August, 2025. But first, the ground it stands on, because this did not come from nowhere, and the run-up is itself extraordinary. On the 23rd of August, 2023, the journal Nature published 2 papers back-to-back in the same volume, 620. The first, by Francis Willett, Aaron Kuntz, and colleagues at Stanford, was titled A High-Performance Speech Neuroprosthesis. The participant was a woman named Pat Bennett, who had lost the ability to speak to ALS. Microelectrode arrays in her cortex. She attempted to speak. The arrays recorded. A decoder converted the neural activity to text at 62 words per minute, 3.5 times the previous record, with a word error rate of about 9% on a 50-word vocabulary, and about 24% on a vocabulary of 125,000 words. That last figure is the important one. It was the first demonstration at large vocabulary, not a menu of phrases, language. The second paper, from Edward Chang's lab at the University of California, San Francisco, led by Sean Metzger and Kalo Littlejohn, was a high-performance neuroprosthesis for speech decoding and avatar control. The participant was Ann Johnson, who had been locked in by a brainstem stroke. A surface electrode array, rather than penetrating electrodes. 78 words per minute. Median word error rate, 25%. And they did not stop at text. They synthesized audible speech in her pre-injury voice, reconstructed from a recording made at her wedding, and they drove a digital avatar of her face, with expressions. A woman who had not spoken in 18 years spoke, in her own voice, with her own face moving. Then, on the 31st of March, 2025, in Nature Neuroscience, Littlejohn, Cho, and colleagues, with Gopala Anumanchipalli and Edward Chang as joint senior authors, published a streaming version. The earlier systems worked in sentence-sized chunks with about an 8-second delay. This one decodes in 80 millisecond increments and produces the first audible sound within about a second of the intent to speak, which is roughly the latency of ordinary conversation. All of that is restoration. All of that is a person trying to speak and a machine helping. Nobody has a problem with any of it, and neither do I. And every one of those participants volunteered for a device that gave them back the thing they had lost. Now the sixth thing. Aaron Kuntz, Benjamin Abramovich Krasa, Francis Willett, and colleagues at Stanford, working within the Brain Gate 2 clinical trial, published in the journal Cell on the 14th of August, 2025. The title is Inner Speech in Motor Cortex and Implications for Speech Neuroprostheses. 4 participants, all with severe speech impairment from ALS or brainstem stroke, all with microelectrode arrays in motor cortex. And the question they asked was not, can we decode attempted speech? That was answered. The question was, what does inner speech look like? Inner speech means the words you say to yourself, silently. The narration running behind your eyes right now as you listen to me. Not whispered, not subvocalized with intent, never attempted aloud, just thought. And the finding is this: inner speech produces neural activity in motor cortex that is similar in structure to attempted speech, but weaker, and it can be decoded from a vocabulary of 125,000 words at up to roughly 74% accuracy. Now, the too specific detail. The detail that ends the argument. And it is not the accuracy figure. They did not set out looking for this. They found it leaking. One participant, during a task, was silently counting, just counting, internally, to keep track of something, and the numbers came out of the machine. The decoder had been trained on attempted speech, on the person trying to talk, and unintended inner speech, words the participant had never attempted to say and never intended to transmit, was picked up and rendered by a system that nobody had. Built for that purpose, and nobody had asked to do it. Something the person had not said, had not tried to say, and had no idea was being read, came out of a device. And so, in the same paper, alongside the discovery, they published the countermeasures. There are two. The first is what they call imagery silenced training. You deliberately train the decoder to ignore inner speech, to recognize its signature, and discard it. The second one is the reason this video has the title it has. The second countermeasure is a password. The decoder does not transcribe anything until the user thinks a chosen key phrase. You think the phrase, and the machine unlocks, and it will read you. You do not think it, and it stays shut. And they report detecting that key phrase with better than 98% accuracy. I will note, because I checked these things, that the specific phrase quoted in press coverage is not something I could confirm against the paper itself. So I will simply say what the paper says. A chosen key phrase. In August of 2025, for the first time in the history of this species, a human being had to set a password on the inside of their own head. Now the honest caveats, and I want them at full strength, because this is the item most likely to be turned into a lie by somebody else's video, and I am not going to be the source of that lie. This is not remote mind reading. It cannot be done to you from across a room, or from a van outside your house, or through a phone. Every result I have described requires either surgically implanted electrodes sitting in the motor cortex of a consenting patient, or a multi-million-dollar magnetic resonance scanner with the subject lying inside it holding still. The decoders are person-specific. They do not transfer. A decoder trained on one participant's brain produces nothing useful from another's, because the mapping between neural population activity and intended speech is idiosyncratic to the individual, and, to a degree, to the particular placement of the array, and it requires active cooperation, not just to build, but to run. There is a companion result here that makes the point beautifully. Jerry Tang, Alexander Huth, and colleagues at the University of Texas at Austin published in Nature Neuroscience on the 1st of May, 2023, a non-invasive semantic decoder, functional MRI, with a decoder built partly on a GPT-style transformer that reconstructs the gist of what a person is hearing, or silently imagining telling, or even watching in a silent film. No surgery at all, and its limitations are the story. It needs about 16 hours of the participant lying in a scanner listening to podcasts to train. It reconstructs meaning, not words, the gist, not the sentence. And the authors explicitly tested whether an unwilling subject could defeat it. They could. Participants who silently counted, or named animals, or told themselves a different story, successfully defeated the decoder. The authors published that, which is exactly what you want scientists to do. And on rate, normal human speech runs 150 to 160 words per minute. These neuroprostheses run at 40 to 50% of that, with error rates well above what would be usable without correction. So, AI can now read your mind is false, and I will not say it, and you should distrust anyone who does. Here is the accurate version, and I want you to notice, as I say it, that it is worse. With your consent, with surgery, and with enough training data, a machine can now approximate the words you are saying, silently, inside your own head, from a vocabulary the size of a dictionary. The researchers did not build that capability on purpose. They discovered it by accident, as a leak, from a system built for something else. And having discovered it, They concluded that the correct engineering response was to install an authentication layer between a person's inner voice and the outside world. The most responsible possible version of this event still ends with a password on a human mind. Now put the two halves together, and I will let it sit. 4,000 years ago, the most credentialed scholars on Earth believed that some knowledge must never be seen by the wrong eyes, and that the last defensible boundary of that knowledge was the surface of a clay tablet, and they protected it with an access clause and a curse. Let the one who knows show. The one who knows. The one who does not know may not see. An abomination of the great gods. In August of 2025, a team at Stanford discovered that the words "a man says silently to himself" were coming out of a machine on their own, and had to invent a password to keep them in. The boundary has moved. It used to be the surface of a tablet. Then it was the surface of a page, and then a hard drive, and then a model whose contents its makers declined to disclose. Now it is the inside of a skull, and there is a lock on it, and the lock was written in the same paper that announced there was a door. They said men would build it, and we just built it, in this decade, in a peer-reviewed journal, with a password bolted on afterwards. The tablet said it would happen, and it is happening. And I will say the frame one more time, because I want no ambiguity at all about what I am and am not claiming. No Assyrian scribe foresaw a microelectrode array. Nobody in Nineveh predicted Stanford. The tablets did not describe technology. They described a boundary and a penalty, a class of knowledge that must not pass to the uninitiated, and a consequence attached to its passing. What I have done for 6 items is show you, with dates and journals and catalog numbers, what has been built across that boundary. The uncanny thing is never the prophecy. The uncanny thing, every single time, is the category. And now the 7th. And the 7th is different from all 6 for one reason. The 7th is not finished. The 7th forbidden thing is not a tower, or a servant, or a fire, or an organism, or a dead animal, or a thought. The 7th forbidden thing is what a human being is allowed to be. And the tablet anchor for this is the single cleanest statement of this video's entire thesis anywhere in the ancient record. It is the story of Adapa. Adapa is a real myth, surviving in 6 fragments. The largest and most important is Fragment B, which comes from the El Amarna archive in Egypt, 14th century before Christ, cataloged as El Amarna 356, the physical tablet being VAT 348 in Berlin. Further fragments come from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, 7 centuries later. The standard scholarly edition is Shlomo Israel's Adapa and the South Wind, published by Eisenbrauns in 2001 in the Mesopotamian Civilization series, and its subtitle matters, "Language has the power of life and death." It is also in Foster's Before the Muses and Daly's Myths from Mesopotamia. The story runs like this. Adapa is a man, a priest of Ea at Eridu, a sage, the first of the sages in some traditions. He is out fishing when the south wind capsizes his boat, and in his fury he breaks the wing of the south wind. The wind stops blowing, and for this he is summoned to appear before Anu, the sky god, in heaven. Before he goes, Ea, his own patron god, the god of the deep, the god who has given him everything, coaches him. Ea tells him how to appease the gatekeepers, and Ea tells him this: when you stand before Anu, they will offer you the food of death and the water of death. Do not eat, do not drink. Adapa goes up. He appeases the gatekeepers exactly as instructed. He stands before Anu, and Anu, having been talked around, offers him the food of life and the water of life, and Adapa refuses, because he was told to. He refuses immortality in the presence of the god who is offering it, because his own god told him it was poison. And in the tradition's logic, he does not just lose it for himself, he loses it for us. Now, the prologue is the money line, and I am going to give you the English only, because I could not verify the Akkadian reconstruction against an accessible edition, and I am not going to put words in a dead language into your ears that I have not checked. In substance, the text says at the outset that Ea gave Adapa wide understanding, the broad design of the land, and did not give him eternal life. It is commonly rendered, he gave him wisdom. He did not give him eternal life. That is the arrangement, stated in the first lines before anything happens. The understanding is granted. The one thing is withheld, and the withholding is deliberate. It is listed as a design decision, not an oversight. And here is where I have to tell you that the most interesting question about this story has no answer. Did Ea lie? There is no scholarly consensus, and the readings are genuinely opposed. One reading, Ea deliberately tricked Adapa in order to preserve the boundary between gods and men. He could not permit his own protege to become immortal, so he set him up to refuse. A second reading, Ea honestly believed the food would be lethal and was simply wrong. A third, this is Israel's, and it is why his subtitle is about the power of language, is that Ea's words were ambiguous or punning, and Adapa misread them. The tragedy is linguistic. And a fourth possibility comes from fragment D, which may not be tragic at all, and in which Anu shows Adapa the splendor of heaven and installs him in his own service. So the correct on-air sentence is, scholars still argue over whether Ea lied, and that unresolvable ambiguity in the founding text about the human limit is either the most artistically perfect thing in ancient literature or an accident of preservation, and nobody can tell you which. And I want to add one connection, carefully. The first of the 7 sages is called Uwana, or Uwan. The Greeks rendered him Owans, the fish-bodied being who, in Berossus, came out of the Erythraean Sea and taught humanity writing, mathematics, city building, temple founding, law, land surveying, and agriculture. And on several inscriptions, the word Adapa is appended to that name as a title, meaning wise. So the precise phrasing is, the first sage, Oana, the one the texts call Adapa, the wise. It is a title, which means the tradition attaches the word for the man who was denied the one thing to the being who taught us everything else. And Berossus, writing around 290 before Christ, gives the consequence in one flat sentence, which in the Verbrugge and Wickersham translation runs, since that time, nothing further has been discovered. A Babylonian priest, in the age of Alexander's successors, believed the human race had discovered exactly nothing new since the beginning. Everything delivered. Then, the well closed. And then, there is Atrahasis. And Atrahasis is where the restriction stops being about knowledge at all. The addition is Lambert and Millard, Atrahasis, the Babylonian Story of the Flood, published by Clarendon Press in 1969. The most complete recension is an Old Babylonian copy from about 1650 before Christ, written by a scribe named Ku'aya. The story, humanity multiplies, and as it multiplies, it produces what the Akkadian calls rigmu, noise, clamor, and huber, uproar, and Enlil cannot sleep, and so he sends the flood. Now, is that noise literal population din, or a metaphor for sin and rebellion? Genuinely contested. Kilmer and Moran read it straightforwardly as overpopulation. Pedinato reads it as the noise of rebellion. Von Soden reads it as humanity encroaching upward on the sphere of the gods. Odin reads the whole thing as the maintenance of the god-human boundary. I am not going to hand you overpopulation as settled, because it is not. But what happens at the end of Atrahasis is not contested at all, and it is the anchor for the seventh thing. After the flood, the gods have a problem. They have destroyed humanity and discovered they need it. So they permit humanity to continue, but they install permanent controls, and the controls are written into the final column of Tablet 3, and there are 3 of them. 1. A category of women who do not bear children, a class set among the people specifically so that they will not reproduce. 2. A demon called the Pashittu, whose function is described in the text as snatching the baby from the lap of the woman who bore it. Institutionalized infant mortality, given a name and a job. 3. Classes of celibate priestesses, the Ugbabtu, the Entu, the Ejisitu, high priestesses and priestesses declared taboo, restricted from childbearing. And the text gives the purpose plainly, so as to cut down childbirth. I want to keep this strictly separate from something we covered in an earlier video. Enlil's pre-flood attempts, the plague and drought and famine at 1200-year intervals, are a different sequence. Do not merge them. These 3 are the post-flood, permanent settlement. So look at what the tradition does in its final act. It does not restrict what men may know. It has already done that with Adapa and with the colophons. In Atrahasis, having permitted humanity to exist at all, the gods reach into the reproductive machinery of the species and install limits, permanently, on how many human beings there may be and which human beings may make more. The last thing the tradition controls is not what men know. It is what men are and how many. Now come forward, and this part has 2 halves: the man who crossed the line and the thing that is being built right now. On the 25th of November, 2018, a Chinese biophysicist named He Jiankui released a set of videos on YouTube alongside an exclusive given to the Associated Press, announcing the birth of twin girls, given the pseudonyms Lulu and Nana, whose genomes he had edited as embryos. The target was the CCR5 gene, intended to confer resistance to HIV. The father was HIV positive. The announcement was timed for the day before the Second International Summit on Human Genome Editing opened in Hong Kong. He presented on the 28th of November to a room of the most senior people in the field, and the organizing committee called the work irresponsible. A 3rd gene-edited child, given the pseudonym Amy, was born in 2019. On the 30th of December 2019, the Shenzhen Nanshan District People's Court convicted him of illegal medical practices, 3 years imprisonment, and a fine of 3 million yuan, roughly $430,000. 2 collaborators, Zhang Renli and Qin Jinzhu, were convicted with lesser sentences, and the court's specific findings matter. They had forged ethical review documents, and they had misled the doctors who implanted the edited embryos. He served the full term and was released in April of 2022. He is under a lifetime ban from reproductive technology work in China. He has resurfaced since repeatedly, announcing ventures, several of which have collapsed or shut down. He currently states that he intends to edit the APOE gene in human embryos for protection against Alzheimer's, motivated by his mother's diagnosis, that no embryos would be implanted, and that the work would begin in mice using base editing. I am reporting what he claims, not what he is doing, because multiple announced institutional affiliations have been denied or terminated. He has been denied visas and had conference invitations withdrawn, and his claims routinely outrun anything verifiable. And on the children, the 3 children who exist, who are real, who are somewhere around 7 or 8 years old right now, I have exactly one honest thing to say, and it is this: we do not know. And that is the scandal. No developmental data has ever been published. No medical follow-up. No follow-up genetic analysis. Nothing. And here is what makes that absence unbearable, rather than merely irritating. The edits were mosaic. Not every cell was edited, and they did not cleanly reproduce the protective CCR 5 delta 32 variant that exists naturally in some human populations. They produced novel deletions of unknown consequence. Off-target effects were never adequately excluded. I am not going to tell you those children were harmed. There is no evidence of that, and it would be a monstrous thing to assert. I am not going to tell you they were enhanced. The speculation about cognitive effects is unsupported, and I'm not going to tell you they are fine, because that claim rests solely on the word of a man who forged ethics documents. The verifiable, sayable fact is the absence. 3 human beings whose genomes were altered before birth in ways that were not what was intended, and the world has no way to assess the outcome. And the man who did it has served his sentence and is announcing new projects. That is the line being crossed once and punished. Now, the thing that is being built openly. In late June of 2025, the Wellcome Trust announced £10 million of funding for a project called the Synthetic Human Genome Project, SynHG. It is led by Jason Chin at the Medical Research Council Laboratory of Molecular Biology in Cambridge and at Oxford, with partners at Cambridge, Kent, Manchester, Oxford, and Imperial College London. It is a 5-year project. Its purpose is to build the foundational tools for synthesizing human genetic material at scale, with a near-term target of constructing a synthetic human chromosome, roughly 2% of the human genome, within 5 to 10 years. Running alongside it is an ethics program called Care Full Synthesis, led by Professor Joy Zhang at the University of Kent. And I want to state the limits with absolute precision, because there is a version of this sentence that is a lie, and it has been printed. Britain is not building a synthetic human. That is false, and I will not say it. A full synthetic human genome is explicitly framed by the project as decades away. The project has no intention of creating synthetic people. The work is confined to cells in dishes. What the critics say is more specific and more interesting than the tabloid version. Bill Earnshaw at Edinburgh has warned that the technology, once it exists, could eventually enable designer babies, enhanced humans, or biological weapons. Not because this project intends any of that, but because tools do not stay with the people who build them. And there is a genetic privacy dimension that I had not considered until I read his objection. If you can synthesize human genomes from sequence data, then a person's genome could in principle be reconstructed in a laboratory without ever contacting that person. Now, the too specific detail for this item, and it is the cleanest number in the entire video. In 2020, Françoise Baylis, Marcy Darnowski, Katie Hassan, and Timothy Cron published a survey in the CRISPR Journal, Volume 3, Issue 5, titled Human Germline and Heritable Genome Editing, the Global Policy Landscape. They looked at 106 countries. 96 of them had relevant policy documents. 78 of those 96 address heritable genome editing for reproduction specifically. 70 prohibit it outright, and not one of the 96 explicitly permits it. Not one. Every government on Earth that has sat down and written the sentence has written it as a no. I will give the honest caveat. Because no country permits, it is not the same as it is banned everywhere. Many countries have no policy at all, and enforcement varies enormously among those that do. The gap is not permission. The gap is silence. And then, on the 12th of July, 2021, the World Health Organization published 2 companion reports from its Expert Advisory Committee, a governance framework and a set of recommendations, after more than 2 years of global consultation. And of everything they recommended, 2 things stand out. The first is a global registry of human genome editing research, and the second is a whistleblowing mechanism for illegal or unethical research. They built a tip line for this. And I will note that WHO recommendations are non-binding, and there is no international enforcement mechanism behind any of it. And here is where this stops being about Sumer. Run the list against yourself, not against history, against your own lifetime, tonight. There is a tower going up in Jeddah right now, 4 meters a week, whose owners will not tell you how tall it is going to be. 900 million people spoke to a made thing this week, and its makers have published a document stating that you are not permitted to know what is inside it. There is a machine in California that made a star for 4 billionths of a second, and gave back 4 times what was put on the target, while drawing 100 times that from the grid. There is an organism alive in a dish tonight whose instructions were printed from bottles of chemicals, with a third of those instructions a mystery to the men who wrote them, and their names misspelling a physicist encoded inside it. There is a company worth $10 billion that told the world it had raised the dead, and whose own chief scientist took it back 6 weeks later. And there is a man in a wheelchair somewhere who has to think a password before a machine will stop reading the words he never said out loud. 6 things, all of them real, all of them documented, all of them in your lifetime, and most of them in the last 4 years. And the 7th is not a warning about a distant future, because the 7th is already funded. 10 million pounds, 5 years. A human chromosome, written from nothing. Not read, written. We finished reading the human genome in 2003, and the world called it the Book of Life. Reading was the last century's project. This century's project is writing. Adapa was given the understanding and denied the one thing. That was the whole arrangement, stated in the opening lines, before the story even starts. Wisdom, yes. Permanence, no. And every version of this story, Adapa, Gilgamesh, the Tower, the Flood, the Colophons, says the arrangement holds, and that everyone who tested it paid. The 7th thing on this list is the one where we find out whether anybody is still enforcing it, and you will be alive to see it. That is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a schedule. 5 years for the tools, 5 to 10 for the chromosome. You will be here. They said men would build it, and we are building it with your century's money in your country while you watch. The tablet said it would happen, and it is happening right now, and it is only 2% done. So let me put the 7 back together in one breath, in order, because the order is the argument. A tower whose height is a secret, going up this week, against a tower whose builders were scattered and whose speech was changed. A servant made out of nothing that answers when 900 million people speak to it, sealed behind a clause its makers wrote to keep you out, against a god who made 2 servants out of the dirt under his fingernail, and against a scribal class that stamped a lock into clay. A star lit in a bunker for 4 billionths of a second, against the one power that was never on the inventory. A living organism written letter by letter and switched on, a third of it unreadable to its own authors, against a tradition in which naming is what brings a thing into being. The dead announced as returned, and quietly unannounced 6 weeks later, against a resurrection the texts permit exactly once, and a rejuvenation plant stolen by a snake before any man could use it. The silent word inside a living human being, extracted at 125,000 word vocabulary and locked behind a password, against a colophon reading, "Let the one who knows show the one who knows. The one who does not know may not see," an abomination of the great gods. And the 7th, unfinished, funded, 5 years, 10 million pounds. What a human being is permitted to be, against a text in which the gods, having spared us, reached into the reproductive machinery of the species and installed permanent limits on how many of us there could be. And I want to say the thing that has been sitting under this entire video, out loud, for the 2nd time. Any one of these, on its own, is explicable. Of course, tall buildings are impressive, and of course, ancient people wrote about towers. Every culture on Earth has a hubris story, and finding a 4,000-year-old sentence that sounds like a rocket is the easiest trick in this genre. Of course, a mythology about maidservants resembles a technology of maidservants, because both are attempts to imagine work without a worker. Take any single item off this list and hand it to a skeptic, and they will dismantle it in 90 seconds. And they will be right, and I would agree with them. That is not the argument. The argument is the set and the order. because the specific things Mesopotamian tradition marks as belonging to the gods and withheld from men: a structure that reaches heaven, a maidservant that speaks, the fire that runs the sky, life fashioned and switched on, the dead returned, the unspoken word inside a person, and the fixed limits of what a human being may be, do not form a random list of ancient anxieties. They form, in almost perfect sequence, the frontier programs of the last 20 years. Each item alone is explicable. All 7 in that order are not. And I am not asking you to believe anything about that. I am asking you to notice it, which is a different request and a harder one to refuse. And now the part I cannot answer, which is the only part that matters. The tablets never say the boundary is guarded. Read them again. This is what unsettled me most while making this. They do not describe centuries. They say the boundary exists, and that everyone who crossed it paid. Adapa reached and lost immortality for all of us. Gilgamesh reached and lost the plant on a riverbank. The builders reached and were scattered, and their speech was changed. Humanity multiplied, and the water came. 6 times now we have reached, and nothing came. No scattering, no flood, no snake on the bank. 6 crossings, documented, dated, published in Nature and Science and Cell, and the sky has stayed exactly where it was. So the question this video cannot answer is the only one worth asking. Was there never a fence, or have we simply not reached the 7th yet? And here's the thought I want to leave with you, because it is the one that kept me at this desk past the point where it was sensible. Every previous item on this list was under construction once. The tower was a permit and a hole in the ground. The servant was a paper on a preprint server. The star was a building full of lasers that had never worked. The organism was a file. Every one of the 6 was, at some point, exactly what the 7th is tonight. Funded, announced, unfinished, and easy to ignore. And the tablets never said the penalty arrives when you finish. They said it arrives when you reach. If you have stayed with me this far, subscribe, properly, right now, before you close this. Not as a favor, because this channel does the version of this material with the museum numbers and the journal citations and the caveats stated out loud, and that version is structurally disadvantaged against the version that just makes things up, and the only thing that keeps it visible is you pressing the button. The next one goes into what the same tradition says about who is actually watching all of this being built, and it is not the part you are expecting. The tablet said it would happen, and it is happening. Stay with me. The next one goes deeper.